Margaret didn't wake up that morning expecting anything to change. At 67, most of her days looked like the ones before them, quiet, folded into routines, softened by time. She fed the cat, watered the geraniums, made her tea just the way she liked it, strong, no sugar, with a squeeze of lemon. The phone buzzed on the counter with a message from her daughter, something about needing help watching the twins again this weekend. Margaret stared at it for a long moment before typing a familiar phrase, "Of course, no problem at all." But before she hit send, something in her paused. A stillness. Not resistance exactly. More like curiosity. She placed the phone back down without replying. Not because she didn't love her daughter, she did fiercely. But because her bones ached, and she hadn't had a full day to herself in months. She poured her tea and walked to the window. Outside, the light was already changing, spilling into the backyard like a soft invitation. A part of her, the part that always said yes, even when her body whispered no, felt nervous. But another part, quieter and older, simply exhaled. That afternoon, she went to the family gathering as planned. Nothing unusual. Her sister-in-law was already talking too loudly in the kitchen. Her nephew was showing off some new watch, and someone had brought a pie that no one would admit was store-bought. Margaret sat in her usual spot, not too close to the center, not too far from the edge. She smiled, nodded, laughed politely. And then it happened. A story. One she had heard a dozen times before. A funny retelling of the time she had gotten lost on a family vacation, and had cried in a phone booth. Everyone laughed, as always. Her cheeks flushed, as always. But this time, she didn't smile. She didn't laugh along. She looked directly at the person telling the story, her cousin Laura, and simply said, "That wasn't funny to me." The room quieted. Not dramatically. Just enough for someone to notice. Laura blinked, caught off guard, then shrugged and mumbled, "I was just kidding." Margaret nodded once, gently, and said, "I know. But it wasn't funny." Then she went back to her tea. No shouting. No confrontation. But in her chest something ancient shifted. That night, when the gathering was over and the house had gone quiet again, Margaret stood in front of the mirror brushing her hair. She looked at her reflection, not critically, not dismissively, just honestly. The lines around her mouth had deepened in recent years. Her hands were softer, her shoulders rounder. But her eyes had clarity. And somewhere beneath them, she could feel the weight of decades of whispered apologies. Apologies for taking too long to decide, for not being fun enough, for saying what she meant, for needing space, for crying in public, for not wanting to stay late, for not answering the phone, for asking for help, for growing older, for being. She set the brush down and whispered to the mirror, "I'm done apologizing for being human." The words weren't loud. They didn't echo. But they felt like roots sinking into the earth, firm, unshakable. The next morning, she opened the message from her daughter and wrote back, "I won't be able to this weekend. I need some time for myself. But I love you and I know you'll figure it out." She expected guilt, anxiety, the familiar tightness in her chest. But none came. Just quiet. Steady. Right. She spent that Saturday in the library. Sat by the window with a stack of poetry she had always meant to read but never had time for. She wrote in the margins. She bought herself a sandwich with too much mustard. She didn't answer her phone, not out of defiance, but out of care. That night, she wore the blue scarf her husband had given her years ago, the one she stopped wearing because someone once said it made her look a bit much. She sat outside on the porch, watching the stars. And when a neighbor passed by and said, "You look beautiful tonight, Margaret," she didn't wave it off or shake her head or say, "Oh, stop." She smiled and said, "Thank you." And that, she realized, was how it began. Not with a scream, not with a declaration, but with a single, sacred choice to stop apologizing for existing. Margaret began noticing just how often the word sorry sat on the edge of her tongue, like punctuation waiting for permission. It appeared in emails she didn't need to write, in conversations where she wasn't at fault, in moments when she took up too much space in a room, or even just a second longer in someone's presence than she thought was allowed. She realized she had been trained, not by any single person, but by the quiet expectations of years and womanhood and survival, to apologize for things that didn't require atonement, like needing help, or having feelings, or changing her mind, or resting. That week, she decided to practice a new kind of awareness. Each time she felt the apology rising, that automatic, reflexive reach for softness, she paused, took a breath, and asked herself, did I really do something wrong, or did I just exist? And more often than not, the answer was clear. At the grocery store, when a stranger bumped into her and she instinctively said, "Oh, I'm sorry," she caught herself mid-sentence and instead said, "Oh, go ahead." No apology, just kindness, without guilt. When her neighbor called to ask if she'd be able to bake something for the community lunch again, she smiled and said, "Not this time, but I hope it goes well." Simple, polite, honest. No explaining, no softening, no apology. It felt strange at first, like learning to walk with a limp you no longer needed. But with each step, her spine straightened. Her voice quieted, but it didn't shrink. It settled, like the sound of a creek that no longer rushes, just flows. One evening, she went to a book club meeting she hadn't attended in months. She wore the red blouse she once saved for birthdays. She spoke when she had something to say. And when a woman interrupted her mid-sentence, as she often did, Margaret didn't raise her voice. She simply paused, then resumed exactly where she left off. And something about that moment, that refusal to vanish, echoed louder than any confrontation ever could. After the meeting, a younger woman named Elise approached her. She was in her early 30s, eyes tired but open, holding her copy of the book like a shield. "I just wanted to say, I noticed what you did tonight. When you kept talking." Margaret tilted her head, unsure. Elise continued, "I don't think I've ever seen someone do that without apologizing." Margaret smiled, warm and quiet, and replied, "I've spent most of my life disappearing politely. I'm learning how to stay." Elise didn't say anything else. She just nodded, like someone witnessing something she hoped to become. That night, Margaret sat on her porch again, the stars still in their places, the breeze a little softer. And she thought about how many versions of herself she had edited over the years. The younger woman who wanted to dance longer at the party but didn't. The mother who pretended she wasn't overwhelmed. The wife who didn't speak when she should have. The friend who agreed to everything just to be liked. And the older woman who, even now, sometimes caught herself shrinking in the name of being easy to love. She whispered to the night no more. Not harshly, not angrily, just finally. The next day, she walked through the farmer's market without rushing. She touched things, smelled tomatoes, sampled jam. When the man at the flower stall asked, "Who are these for?" as she picked out tulips, she smiled and said, "For me." He grinned. "That's the best kind." At home, she placed the tulips in an old vase and wrote a note to herself on a torn piece of brown paper. "I am not sorry for being here." She taped it to the fridge, not for anyone else to read, just for herself. A reminder, a promise, a small rebellion that looked like peace. And in that ordinary afternoon, with sunlight warming her kitchen and tulips leaning into the light, Margaret knew this was what healing could look like. Not loud, not perfect, but real, steady. A quiet reclamation of space, not in the world, but in herself. Margaret hadn't expected the world to notice her shift, but slowly it did. Not through fanfare or declarations, but in glances, pauses, recalculations. People who had once leaned on her by habit began to hesitate, sensing something had shifted in the soft architecture of her presence. She still smiled. She still helped. But there was a new rhythm to her boundaries, not walls, but well-drawn lines. Lines that said, "I am here, but not owned. I am kind, but not for rent." It was a revelation how much of her life had been lived in service to pleasing others, not because they demanded it, but because she had offered it before they could even ask. She began to walk differently through her days. Her steps were slower, but with intention. Her posture changed, not to appear proud, but to feel balanced. She started wearing the earrings she had always loved, but kept hidden in drawers because someone once called them a bit much for your age. She wore them to the post office, to the market, to the kitchen. She wore them like punctuation, a small, shimmering sentence that said, "I don't need your permission to feel beautiful." One afternoon, she attended a lunch with a few women from her church. The table was filled with light conversation, grandkids, recipes, gentle complaints about aging knees. But somewhere between the pie and the coffee, one of the women made a comment about how Margaret had become so particular lately. It wasn't cruel, just a small seed, tossed out like sugar. Margaret stirred her drink slowly and looked up with a steady smile. "I think you mean that I've started telling the truth," she said. The woman blinked, laughed nervously, and nodded. Margaret didn't flinch, didn't explain. She simply went back to her pie. That evening, she recounted the moment in her journal. She didn't write it with triumph, but with clarity. She knew she wasn't becoming difficult. She was becoming honest. For the first time in her life, she could feel her yes and no's lining up with what she truly meant, and that alignment felt holy. She began returning to old habits that once brought her joy but had been shelved in the name of practicality. She painted again, not well, not for anyone else, just enough to watch color return to her fingertips. She started humming while folding laundry, whispering old love songs into the fabric of her life. And when Anna, her granddaughter, asked her one afternoon if she could paint her nails a bright coral color, just for fun, Margaret didn't hesitate. "Absolutely," she said. And when Anna giggled and said, "You look kind of cool like that," Margaret laughed and whispered, "Maybe I always was." It wasn't that she no longer cared what others thought. It was that their opinions no longer outranked her own. She stopped replying to messages immediately, choosing instead to wait until she had the energy. She let calls go to voicemail. She read slowly, ate slowly, walked slowly, not because she was old, but because rushing no longer felt like a virtue. One morning, standing in front of her mirror, she looked at her reflection for longer than usual. She used to scan for flaws, dark circles, creased skin, softening features. But now she looked with a kind of reverence. Not because she had become younger, but because she had become whole. She touched her cheek gently and whispered, "You've carried me well." That weekend, she declined another invitation, this time, a group trip that once would have drained her, even if she smiled through it. She sent a thoughtful reply, wished them well, and stayed home to tend her garden. There, with her hands in soil and her hair pinned back in a way that reminded her of her mother, she felt a depth of peace that had nothing to prove. And she realized that for so long, she had mistaken being liked for being loved, and now, in her solitude, she was finally learning what it meant to love herself without asking for approval in return. That night, she wrote a short note and tucked it into her notebook. It said, "Today I chose peace over pleasing." And the world didn't fall apart. In fact, it felt more like home. It happened on a rainy Thursday, the kind of soft, gray afternoon that seemed made for quiet revelations. Margaret was sitting by the window with a blanket over her knees and a book resting open in her lap, though she hadn't turned a page in over 20 minutes. The tea beside her had gone cold, but she didn't mind. She was listening, not to anyone in particular, but to herself. That new voice inside, no longer timid, no longer tangled in apology. A voice that asked for nothing but her presence. Then, from down the hallway, came the light patter of feet and the unmistakable sound of Anna's soft knock on the door. "Grandma?" Margaret looked up, smiling. "Come in, love." Anna entered the room with her phone in one hand and a worried look in her eyes. She hesitated, sat on the edge of the bed, and said, "Can I ask you something?" Margaret nodded. Anna stared at her hands. "How do you say no, without feeling mean?" The question landed gently, like a leaf on water, but it rippled through Margaret's chest in waves. She reached for Anna's hand, warm and uncertain, and held it between her own. "You don't say it to hurt," she said softly. "You say it to honor." Anna looked confused. Margaret continued, "You honor your time, your energy, your truth. Saying no isn't rejection. It's choosing with intention. And choosing yourself doesn't make you cruel. It makes you clear." Anna exhaled, nodding slowly. I always feel like I owe people something, she said. Their expectations. Their plans. Margaret smiled, not out of amusement, but recognition. I know that feeling. I lived with it for a long time. I thought being good meant being agreeable. But all it did was teach me how to vanish. Anna blinked, her throat catching. I don't want to disappear. Margaret leaned in, kissed her forehead, and whispered, then don't. Take up space, darling. With grace. With truth. The right people will never ask you to shrink. That night, Margaret lay awake longer than usual, staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft rhythm of the rain against the glass. She thought about all the women in her family, her grandmother, her mother, even herself, who had learned to keep peace at the cost of their own voice. Women who made themselves small so others could feel large. Women who whispered when they wanted to sing. Women who said it's fine when it wasn't. But tonight, lying in the dark with Anna's question still echoing, Margaret felt a quiet pride. The chain was breaking. Not in fire or fury, but in warmth, in presence, in a conversation by the window. A few days later, Anna left a note on her nightstand. It was written in neat cursive on a torn page from a school notebook. It read, "Thank you for reminding me that I'm allowed to exist fully. I love you." Margaret read it 3 times, then folded it carefully and tucked it into her journal. That evening, she opened a fresh page and wrote, "The greatest apology I ever stopped making was for being who I am." And that sentence felt like a key, not unlocking a door, but locking one behind her. No going back. No returning to the habit of erasing herself for comfort. She was no longer interested in making herself palatable. She was interested in being whole. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't chasing peace. She was becoming it. Spring arrived quietly, not with a grand announcement, but with the soft unfolding of petals along the fence and the smell of warmed earth returning to the garden beds. Margaret could feel it, not just in the weather, but in her bones, in the way her shoulders no longer curled inward, in the way her voice no longer hesitated before speaking. There was a steadiness to her now, not the kind that demanded attention, but the kind that rooted itself in peace, the kind that grew after decades of hiding. One morning, she stepped outside to find her neighbor, Rose, a woman in her early 70s, struggling to carry 2 heavy grocery bags from her car. Margaret approached, offered her hands without a word, and together they brought them to the porch. As they caught their breath, Rose glanced sideways and said, "You seem lighter these days." Margaret smiled gently. "I stopped apologizing for existing," she said. Rose blinked, surprised, then let out a small, knowing laugh. "Took me until 69 to do that," she replied. They sat for a while, not talking much, just letting their silences sit side by side like old friends. That afternoon, Margaret cleaned out the last of her just-in-case drawers, the ones filled with objects she kept to please others. Dresses she never liked but wore because they were gifts. Teacups she never used. Letters she never sent. And as she packed them into a donation box, she whispered a small thank you to each one, not for what they were, but for teaching her what she no longer needed. She moved through the house not as a caretaker, not as someone trying to preserve appearances, but as a woman reclaiming her space, her preferences, her presence, her rhythm. She left the scarf she loved hanging on the coat rack. She filled the fruit bowl with the ones she liked, not the ones others preferred. She lit candles at noon just because she liked the way the flame danced in the daylight. One evening, as Anna curled up beside her on the couch, book in hand, she asked, "Grandma, what do you wish someone had told you when you were my age?" Margaret thought for a long moment, then said that being a good woman doesn't mean being a quiet one, and that you don't owe anyone your silence to earn their comfort. Anna leaned her head on Margaret's shoulder, and for a long time, they didn't speak. They just breathed together, generations stitched by tenderness, by listening, by unlearning. A few weeks later, Margaret wrote her final letter in the journal she'd been filling for months. Not a letter of apology, not a letter of farewell, but a letter of arrival. It began, "Dear future me, I hope you remember that soft is not weak, and truth is not unkind. I hope you wear the bright colors, speak when moved, and rest when tired. I hope you continue to belong to yourself before you belong to anyone else. And above all, I hope you remember there was never anything wrong with you. Only with the silence you thought you had to live inside. She signed it with her full name. Not abbreviated. Not initialed. The whole thing. Margaret Elaine Whitmore. A name she had finally grown into. That weekend, her daughter came by with flowers and laughter, and as they cooked together in the kitchen, Margaret found herself telling stories she hadn't told in years, not because they were finally safe to share, but because she no longer needed to hide behind neatness. She didn't edit the painful parts. She didn't soften the joy either. She let the full truth live on the tongue. And when her daughter looked at her, eyes shining, and said, "You're different, Mom," in a beautiful way, Margaret replied, "I think I'm just finally myself." That night, she sat on the porch alone, wrapped in a blanket, looking up at a moon that seemed to understand. She sipped her tea slowly, let the warmth settle in her chest, and smiled into the dark. No regrets. No pretending. No apologies. Just breath. Just being. Just home.